Hi there, my name is Lisa Jewell, and I'm the Outreach and Housing Coordinator here at the Fort St. John Women's Resource Society.
And I am Telitha Nielson. I am the family law advocate at the Fort St. John Women's Resource Society. Today we're going to be talking about CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women.
So just to provide a bit of context, we were invited to participate in a 10-week program that was actually offered by the International Women's Human Rights Institute. So it was a super exciting course that gave us loads of information that we're going to try to break down and give you a rundown on so that you can take all of these important facts and apply it into your practice or into your daily lives. So just a little bit about CEDAW history. The convention was adopted by the UN General Assembly on the 18th of December 1979, but it wasn't entered into force until September 3rd of 81. So you can see that that's a 2-year gap. Like, it's a pretty big gap in between when it was first created versus when it was first brought into play by the UN General Assembly. CEDAW became an instrument that has saved and changed the lives of women and gave possibilities beyond what everyone thought was ever going to be able to be possible. So far, 188 states have ratified the CEDAW Convention as of May 2014. So this means that they've agreed with the convention and they're going to uphold the rights in the treaty within their state. The United States continues to be the only state that has not ratified with the convention. The women's rights were not considered human rights until 1993.
Fourth World Conference on Women, Beijing Declaration. The governments participating in the Fourth World Conference on Women gathered in Beijing in September 1995. It was determined to advance the goals of equality, development, and peace for all women everywhere in the interest of all humanity, acknowledging the voices of all women everywhere and taking note of the diversity of women and their roles and circumstances, honoring the women who paved the way and inspired by the hope present in world's youth. They recognize that the status of women has advanced in some important respects in the past decade, but that progress has been uneven. Inequalities between women and men have persisted and major obstacles remain, with serious consequences for the well-being of all people. They also recognize that this situation is exacerbated by the increasing poverty that is affecting the lives of the majority of world's people, in particular women and children, with origins in both the national and international domains. Enhancing further the advancement and empowerment of women all over the world, and agree that this requires urgent action in the spirit of determination, hope, cooperation, and solidarity now and to carry us forward into the next century. So states that have ratified reaffirm their commitment to the equal rights and inherent human dignity of women and men and other purposes and principles enriched in the Charter of the United Nations, to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international human rights instruments, in particular CEDAW, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women and the Declaration on the Right to Development. Ensure the full implementation of the human rights of women and of the female child as an inalienable integrated part of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. Build on consensus and progress made at previous UN conferences and summits. Empowerment and advancement of women, including the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religious, and belief, thus contributing to the moral, ethical, spiritual, and intellectual needs of women and men, individually or in community with others, and thereby guaranteeing them the possibility of realizing their full potential in society and shaping their lives in accordance with their own aspirations.
So, I mean, in short, because that's a whole lot of information, a group of women got together from around the world to discuss the rights that women should be able to experience. So whether that's the right to employment or the right to safe housing or the right to be free from violence, etc. After an empowering conference, they then took the commitments that they'd agreed to reaffirm back to their nations and decided to work on the ground to influence their own individual governments to start applying the rules and regulations that CEDAW is setting out to reaffirm the rights for women into their policies.
We were hoping to show you some videos, but what we'll have to do is we'll have to send the links to the videos out when this video is sent out. So what happened? Before the 19th century, citizens did not have a right before the state. They were subject of the king with no rights. In the 19th century, individuals gained this right in certain states. Even women gained some rights. In 1904 and 1910, 2 conventions combating women's rights were given to women, but not considered human rights convention. They did not fight for equality just yet. Acceptance of the concept of the International Human Rights Charter of UN in 1945. Acceptance of women's legal rights. Women needed to be deemed capable to have legal rights, and in the 18th century, the first women's rights movement took place. Acceptance of the idea that men and women could enjoy equal rights.
So, I mean, 1993, women's rights are now human rights. So this recognizes that violence against women recognizes this whole issue problem as a human rights violation now. CEDAW is understood as a human rights treaty and part of the United Nations human rights system as a piece of the whole puzzle that fits together. At this time, it existed as a treaty, but when it was recognized that it should be part of the human rights system. So what is CEDAW? It's a legal document because it is a treaty, but it's also a political agenda. It's a guide for sustainable democracy, a guide for interpersonal relations, and can be used in families and schools to guide our relations with one another. It is one of the 9 core treaties in the United Nations Human Rights Treaty System. It was adopted because the UN finally recognized that discrimination against women happens in all spheres of life, in all classes, in every ethnic or other group of human beings. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from. Discrimination against women can be a possibility in your home, in your community, in your school, in your workplace. It doesn't matter. It's a living document, which means that it's constantly being updated and worked on so that it can be brought up to include other issues that are being brought to CEDAW's attention. It includes women of all ages, and it's guided by 3 principles, which are the videos that we're hoping to send out to you guys, based on substantive equality, non-discrimination, and the state's obligation to uphold treaty rights.
So CEDAW goals are the full realization of all women's human rights, equality of opportunities, equality of access to them, equality in and under the law, equality of results, and transformation of society.
So the basic notions of the human rights is that human rights are inherent to all human beings. It does not matter what gender, where you're from, where you live, how much money you make, what your ethnicity is, where you come from. It applies to all people. It began when people first started fighting for what they wanted, which was freedom generally. Human rights are secular, which, for example, means that they are not just for the religious folks or just for people who are following a certain way of life. They're an ethical guide, including political rights and global humanity, and they're important to everyone. Human rights happen in our bodies, and we need to be aware of our bodies, and when it's violated, that is a human rights violation. So we're basing these human rights on the value of a human person, any person. The need to protect other humans, the intrinsic equality of all, and respect and love for life, and also the need to be accountable. The key principles of the human rights is the indivisibility, so we're all equally important. So one of the CEDAW rules are not more important than any of the others. The inalienability, so you can't be stripped of your human rights where it doesn't matter. Interdependence, you need other rights to enjoy one right, meaning all human rights are related to each other in some way, shape, or form. And they're universal, so everyone is entitled to all of their rights. Human rights are always expanding with new rights and emerging and new ways of understanding and protecting them.
States have a legal obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill everyone's human rights without discrimination and are accountable to the international community for implementing these obligations.
So that brings us to the general recommendations, number 19 and 35, which are more related to the topic of violence against women. So CEDAW adopted its first guidance on violence against women, which is general recommendation number 19. But general recommendation 35 provides more comprehensive guidance to accelerate the elimination of gender-based violence against women and girls. So it's basically talking about what is considered a human rights violation by setting out these general recommendations that the states can follow to implement within their individual policies. So before 1993, violence against women was not considered a violation of human rights. What is that? So in 2016, concluding observations on the combined 8th and 9th periodic reports, which were the most recent reports that CEDAW has conducted in Canada regarding gender-based violence against women. So these are the concerns that the committee brought to the attention. Continue high prevalence of gender-based violence against women in the state party, in particular against Indigenous women and girls. The low number of cases of violence against women reported to the police by victims, the low rates of prosecution and conviction when it is reported, the lack of a national action plan, the lack of shelters and support services reportedly prevents victims from leaving their violent partners. If women don't have somewhere to go, how are they supposed to leave a situation of abuse? This isn't right. The lack of statistical data on gender-based violence against women, particularly on investigations, prosecutions, convictions, sentences, reparation, the failure to cover all situations under protecting Canadians from online crime acts even. This is Canada.
So in regards to violence against women, CEDAW recommends that the state party enhance efforts to combat all forms of gender-based violence against women, paying particular attention to minority and Indigenous women, increase reporting by women of violence, provide capacity building programs and cultural training regarding Indigenous women for judges, prosecutors, police officers, and other law enforcement officials on the application of criminal law provisions on violence against women, and raise public awareness of the criminal nature of such acts. Enforce its criminal legislation at the federal, provincial, and territorial levels, and ensure that all cases of violence against women are thoroughly and effectively investigated and perpetrators prosecuted and adequately punished. I don't see why we have to tell the state to do that. That
Right.
should just be a given.
So a crime happens, naturally, the state is supposed to want to investigate, prosecute, punish the offender, which is the whole concept of justice. Why are we actually having to be told as a nation, you must prosecute the offenders that are committing acts of violence against women? Seriously?
Adopt a national action plan in consultation with civil society organizations, especially Indigenous women's organizations, to combat gender-based violence against women, and ensure that adequate human, technical, and financial resources are allocated for its implementation, mentoring, and assessment.
Again, shouldn't have to be said, but here we are.
Strengthen services for women who are victims of gender-based violence, including by establishing shelters throughout the territory of the state party and ensuring the availability of psychosocial rehabilitation and reintegration programs. Systemically collect data on all forms of gender-based violence against women, protection orders, prosecutions, and sentences imposed on perpetrators. Again, should be a given. Review and amend legislation in order to provide adequate civil remedy to victims of cyber violence and reintroduce Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act.
Okay, so speaking of talking about things that necessarily shouldn't have to be said, why is Canada being told, hey, Canada, you're missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls? This is a problem. obviously this is a problem. So some of the concerns that the committee has is insufficient measures taken to ensure that all cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women are duly investigated and prosecuted. Hello, they're people. The term of reference of the National Inquiry, which do not clearly require the application of the human rights-based approach, is called for by the Canadian Human Rights Commission, do not include any explicit mandate to review policing policies and practices in the criminal justice system, and don't provide any mechanisms for independent reviews of alleged cases of inadequate or partial policing investigation. So then when this happens, and we have some of our friends and family and people that we work with and community members in Canada that are, you know, of Indigenous descent going missing, we're still being told that they're being investigated when they're not. And we have zero way of providing any kind of reprimanding actions to RCMP services that are not properly investigating them. This is a problem. So the committee has made recommendations. So obviously the first one, ensuring that all cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women are duly investigated and prosecuted. Okay, boss, like this shouldn't have to be said. Complement the terms of reference of the National Inquiry with a view to, 1, ensure the use of human rights-based approach, ensuring that the mandate of inquiry clearly covers the investigation of the role of the RCMP, provincial police, municipal police, public complaints commissioned across federal, provincial, and municipal jurisdictions. There has to be a way to bring this up. Hey guys, you're not doing your job. Can we start? Establishing a mechanism for the independent review of cases in which there are allegations of inadequate or partial police investigations. Like, I mean, I understand they're busy and everything, but a missing woman is a missing woman. I don't really care why or how or what the assumption is. Like, no one is in a position to make those kind of judgments about another person. If someone is missing, let's go find them. So some root causes of violence and discrimination against Indigenous women. So the committee is concerned that Indigenous women continue to suffer from multiple forms of discrimination, in particular with regard to their access to employment, housing, education, and healthcare, and continue to live in poverty in the state poverty party, as reflected by high poverty rates, poor health, inadequate housing, lack of access to safe water, and low school completion rates. But then that's the things that they want to state when one of these women go missing. Her lifestyle, oh, she's living in poverty. You're putting them in this situation. In 2007, the state committed to fully implementing the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. The committee remains concerned about the lack of coherent plan or strategy to improve the socioeconomic conditions of Indigenous communities, in particular, Indigenous women, in order to combat the root cause of their vulnerability to violence, and about the lack of measures to break the cycle of distrust between authorities and Indigenous communities, as determined by the committee's inquiry. Well, yeah, if you have a bunch of your family members going missing and people are not investigating them, I'm not sure how much trust I would have either.
Okay, now we're moving on to employment. So the committee is concerned about slow progress made in the field of employment, gender wage gap, which affects women's career development and pension benefits, lack of effective legislation on the principle of equal pay for work of equal value, continuing horizontal and vertical occupational segregation, and the concentration of women in part-time and low-paid jobs, which is often due to their parallel traditional child raising and caretaking responsibilities, as well as the low representation of women in managerial positions in companies. Lack of affordable childcare facilities and low use of parental leave by fathers. Sexual harassment in the workplace, especially in male-dominated sectors. Limited access by Indigenous women in the labor market. Practice of issuing employer-specific closed work permits, which makes it challenging for migrant workers, including caregivers, to leave abusive situations. Employment and what the committee recommends. So take all measures necessary to narrow wage gap. which is still a very prominent thing in today's society. There is wage gaps between men and women still happening. Increase minimum wage, adopt effective measures, including skills training and incentives for women to work in non-traditional professions, eliminate occupational segregation, adopt quotas to enhance the representation of women in managerial positions in companies, create more opportunities for women to gain full access to full-time employment, including by adopting a rights-based national childcare framework in order to provide sufficient and adequate childcare facilities and strengthen incentives for men to exercise their right to parental leave. Develop a confidential and safe system for filing complaints relating to sexual harassment in the workplace.
So, I mean, knowing all of this, where do we stand, Canada? Well, in BC, 1 in 5 children are still living in poverty. Why are people not always disclosing domestic assaults or violence to the RCMP? When women workers in Canada earn on average 69 cents for every dollar earned by men in 2016 for doing the same job. Half of all women in Canada have experienced at least one incident of physical or sexual violence since the age of 16. 67% of Canadians say they have personally known at least one woman who has experienced physical or sexual abuse, but how many men say that they have either committed or know other men who have committed acts of physical or sexual abuse? I mean, just saying, that's not something that you hear about. On any given night in Canada, 3,491 women and their children, of 2,724 in numbers, sleep in shelters because it's not safe at home. At least they had a place to go. Because on any given night, about 300 women and their children are turned away because the shelters are full. There was 1,181 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada between 1980 and 2012, according to the RCMP. However, grassroots organizations and the Minister of Status of Women say the number is much higher, closer to 4,000 people. It's a little off. Indigenous women are killed at 6 times the rate of non-Indigenous women. We need to protect our peers. About 26% of all women who were murdered by their spouses had already left the relationship. So, I mean, the whole concept of why don't you just leave doesn't always apply or protect them either.
And if anybody's interested on where these stats are coming from, you find them at
the Canadian Women's Foundation website. They have tons and tons of great information. So thank you, Canadian Women's Foundation. So where do we stand in Fort St. John? That's where we're from. That's where we're evaluating. I invite you to evaluate your community. So we collected stats from the RCMP statistics that were released for 2020. So they reported that spousal dispute with no assault, there was 219 cases. Keeping in mind, this is in a population of about 22,000 people. Spousal abuse, 14. Spousal assault, 165. Spousal other offense, 113. So we know that these are not accurate numbers due to the dark figure crime, and that these numbers do not actually reflect the number of cases that come through our organization, because our stats are way above that.
On any given month, to put that into perspective, on any given month, I am seeing upwards to 20 cases of spousal assault or abuse.
Yeah, I have it coming through the doors too, as we also have a second stage transitional housing program that houses women fleeing domestic violence. And every month we have so many women that come in that aren't quite ready to leave yet, or maybe scared because of the other barriers that are put up in the community. A multitude of reasons on why they're coming in, talking to us about it. But these numbers are not accurate. There's no way. So in the outreach store here at the Women's Resource Society, I'd just like to bring attention to the number of people that are using our services, which does include coming in and talking to myself as an outreach worker about cases of domestic violence, accessing food supports, essential hygiene supplies, harm reduction, referrals in the community, etc. So if you take a look, the green line represents 2019. So you can tell that it starts off in January at about 600 cases, and then it drops down to about 350 by June, and then it slowly starts to creep up in September again, and then it kind of goes up and down for the rest of the year. In the year 2020, the other, I want to say more teal green, that's a representation on how it was more of a steady year. We saw a consistent, steady increase of numbers coming in to access these supports monthly. And then you look at 2021. So this is after a year of pandemic, after a year of people having to self-isolate and losing employment options and being stuck in situations where there's no rentals available and, you know, work is scarce, especially for the service industry where women typically start out after leaving some kind of long-term relationship in that fashion. But we start off right around the same at the 600 mark. And then by April, we're over 1,000. And then by June, we're over 1,600 people. So this number has quite literally tripled since 2019. So in 2 years, we're seeing 3 times the amount of people coming in. This is insane. This should not be happening. Our jobs should not exist. So, and then it dropped down again in July, but I mean, it's been consistently busy.
Good. These are the family law advocacy program stats, the program that I run. My stats generally stay around the same, although you can't see the last few months on this graph, but they have increased again. But beginning of COVID, my stats went through the roof, and it was terrifying because organizations were shutting down. Some hotels weren't allowing people in. Some transition houses weren't taking people in, and my domestic violence cases went absolutely through the roof. It was almost every single client that I spoke to was wanting to leave a domestic violence situation.
They were scared.
Yeah, and we had to outsource. We had to send people, you know, out of town, wherever we could find somewhere that would take somebody in. At the beginning of a pandemic, it was terrifying.
Every day, it was terrifying.
Yeah, and people were stuck in these houses with their partners, whether they're isolating or no work or whatever the case may be, and they have children there who are being affected by this, and it was terrifying. Yeah.
So, I mean, we invite you to assess your own stats in comparison. If you happen to work with women who might be experiencing gender-based violence, take a look at the CEDAW conventions, see what is supposed to be implemented in your organization, in your province, in your nation. Canada is really not holding up their end of the deal when it comes to ratifying with CEDAW. We have a long ways to go where women can actually say that they are not being discriminated against for the sake of being women. That's to say, not all agencies and not all men are practicing discrimination against women, but the ratios still are not matching up, if you know what I mean. So, I mean, take a look at what you have going on around you. Do you have women suffering from being discriminated? Do you have a massive wage gap in your employment agency for doing the exact same kind of work as your male counterparts? You should be making equal pay. Just take a look at it. Thanks for watching.
Thank you. Stop share.